So I'm going to talk very briefly, mostly because I'm actually more interested in the talks that come after mine um, with Lavinia Thomas and Daniel. And I think it's fair to say that each of those talks, particularly from my interest, represents a critical step in, let's call it the blockchain supply chain of the built environment. And you can see that the built environment, using it as a broader term, really starts from, well, what is it we want to do? What's the vision? Where do we want to go? What's the what design? What's it going to look like? What do we want to build? What do we need? And then you go through a whole supply chain of, can we buy the land? Can we do the design? Can we do the construction? How are we going to operate this? And it feeds in at every single point. And this is where blockchain I find super interesting because it can support and make much more efficient each of those phases. So I'm not going to dwell particularly on the book. I will play out a few points here and there as I talk through. But what I wanted to look at and think about and contextualize this section is, well, what's happening in the rest of the world? Because over the last year, 18 months or so, there's been some incredible efforts by governments and innovators, entrepreneurs alike, to really adopt blockchain and begin to plug it in to those key stages. So I've called it massive tokenization because what I'm going to talk about, if I can skip the slide forward, is three pretty large projects. And I've chosen these because they are around the world. They're on three different continents, significant, and they're significant not only from a technical perspective, from a technology perspective, but also from a legal perspective. So the first thing I'll touch on, and it's really the start of many journeys, is Dubai and their recent tokenization of effectively their land registry. And then I'll move on to some commercial property. This is the MUFG bank office building in Osaka. They tokenized a skyscraper. I don't think it was actually this one, but I've struggled to identify which one it actually was. But this is their building and it looks very nice. Then I'll touch on a project in Canada. This is in Quebec, and it is a residential development. So you can see that tokenization is being applied at every sector and in every space. Okay, so Dubai. Now, one of the cornerstone ideas of tokenization has been, well, what is it you're tokenizing? And is it the land? Is it the building itself? Is it the finance? What is it you want to achieve? And in most common law jurisdictions, of which the UK is one, tokenization of land titles is not, it's not achievable. Let's put it that way. The law restricts how you can register, how many people can own, who can own land. And what you can't have is, oh, here's a million people and they all own this piece of land because we've tokenized it. The land registry of the government will just say, go away, don't be ridiculous. But to overcome that, we would require a fundamental change in the law. And I don't really see many governments willing to do that. And so it's super interesting that the Dubai government has pressed ahead with this. So through their REASE initiative, Real Estate Evolution Space Initiative, if I remember the acronym properly, they've connected to land titles blockchain in partnership with Ripple. The idea being that you can take the land title, you can fractionalize it in the way that we all know and love, and you can sell that to investors. And for around 2,000 dirhams, which is about £400, £500, something in that region, you can own a slice of whatever it is they're selling. So this becomes very interesting because you have, let's say, primary ownership rights over the land, and therefore there is value in that land. And should it go up in value and want to sell, you can sell your tokens and realize your investment. This is all driven by a greater need for liquidity in and around real estate. It's very illiquid as an investment. And this has been running for around about 18 months now. I think it ended its trial period around March this year. They've tokenized several properties, and it's only open to Dubai residents or ID card holders. So it's not like you can just rock up there and say, okay, let me have some pieces of land. But this is very interesting. But it also then raises several critical legal issues. On the one hand, you've got liquidity, which is great. On the other hand is, well, what is it you're holding? You and several thousand other people own a little piece of, and we would say land, but from a lawyer's perspective, we would also say, well, you actually, what you hold is risk and liability. Typically, when you own land, you are responsible for anything that happens on it. Now, yes, you can buy insurance and so on, but God forbid something horrible goes wrong and the insurance doesn't stand by, you're on the hook. And I liken this to a case, and I do touch on it in the book, so please go look that up. In America, albeit so obviously not directly applicable, legally speaking, of Uki Dow. And effectively, the Dow was found to be selling securities unlicensed, so the government came in and shut them down. And then the courts decided that anybody who held the Uki Dow token was an unincorporated association and that they were all jointly and severally liable. And you might think, oh, well, that's okay. Well, look, there's some liability and we're going to share it with everybody that holds a token. Well, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is how do you enforce that? Because if I'm coming to claim some money because I've lost it, all I need to do is find one token holder and they're on the hook for the full amount. And in the Uki Dow case, it was around $650,000. So if I find you and you're the token holder, I'll have my $650,000, please. And it's no defense for you to say, yeah, but me and all these other people hold it. I don't have to find them. That's your problem. And you can see that if that is the case in Dubai and you're holding a multi-billion pound property, your exposure is significant. And that's before we get to considerations of, well, who are these token holders? Have they been through a KYC process? Have they been through an anti-money laundering process? What is your source of wealth? How are you holding this? And then there's other questions. Well, if I take my token and I transfer it because I've sold it, where does that responsibility lie? Am I still registered with the land registry as the owner, or is it the new person? Or if I lose control of my wallet and somebody else takes it over, who remains liable? If I'm registered and that's not changed, then I remain liable. And so there's a whole series of administration type questions behind this that I must admit I've not seen answered yet, although on the flip side, it's a great idea, and it's really how to attack liquidity in land deals. So moving swiftly on. So Japan, MUFG, big bank, and they tokenized some building. I say I've not been able to identify which one it is. If anybody does have any insights into that, it would be great to know. The picture here is MUFG's building in Osaka. Looks beautiful, as you might expect. And this is a regulated framework. So an STO framework, so this is a security token. So the bank, but they are allowed, are selling securities and you're able to invest. The idea being they're trying to create liquidity again, as they were in Dubai, by opening up retail access to investors. From what I understand, it's the bank that retains ownership of the property, or certainly it's held on trust by them. So then there's a question, well, what is the security actually representing? Does it represent some ownership stake in the company that owns the building? Is it something to do with the debt or the finance in the building? Is it the land under the building? Is it the pane of glass that's in the window? And that's not very clear. Presumably, if I had access to the investment agreements, albeit in Japanese, maybe that would be a lot clearer, but it does raise a question. And more importantly, and again, it comes back to the points I mentioned a few moments ago, is, well, what do I do? How do I realize my investment? How can I sell this? How can I trade this? Can I sell it on to my friend? Am I allowed to sell it on to my friend? What if I sell it to a sanctioned entity? Then I'm in trouble. What if? And again, as lawyers, put our oh dear hat on and say, well, what if it all goes wrong and oh dear if it does? But again, here we have an institutional investor, the bank, looking at blockchain as a way of offering large-scale investments. And this is driven by banks, so it must be compliant. They have to be compliant, else I don't know who the regulator in Japan is, but they would come in and swiftly shut it all down. But they are doing it. So you have the government on one hand, you have government approval on another, in Dubai, and then in Japan, and then you have large institutional lenders also looking at this and affecting these types of structures, investment structures. And the last one I wanted to touch on, and unfortunately, I've not been able to find a better picture of what this actually is. This is from the TRI's website, which is obviously a work in progress. I presume it's moved on something since then, but this is all we can see. So this is a residential development. So here we've had land, we've had the commercial building in Japan, and now we've got the residential development. This is in Champlain, this is Quebec, in Canada. And large development, 300 million as the note says. And it comes back very similarly to the questions I mentioned a few moments ago. Is, okay, what am I buying? Am I buying a piece of the finance? Am I buying some future option? What is it? Who knows? But now we're leveraging capital and on a much larger scale. And one of the core advantages of blockchain is that network effect. You can get a lot of people involved in something very cheaply, very quickly, and globally. And so your resource pool for investment is effectively the world. That makes it a very different prospect than trying to deal with banks who can, let's say, be quite challenging when it comes to getting money out of them. So I won't dwell too much on that, but thinking very carefully and cross-comparing those, it's interesting to see that governments and large regulated institutions, banks, large developers are beginning to move into this place where they're seeing the value in being able to tokenize. Not that they perhaps didn't know that, but they've certainly not affected it or were concerned certainly around the legal ramifications of that. But they are moving into these sorts of spaces and beginning to free up and open up and see the value in leveraging blockchain, its network effect, to drive liquidity into any particular investment. So let's not dwell on that. So risks, I've touched on risks throughout. They all remain issues. They are touched on in the book as well. So again, I encourage everybody to go and have a read of that. Some obvious, as I say, key issues, and I mentioned title enforceability. Well, it's not just the title in the land, but it's also, well, what is the thing I own? What is the security thing I own? And is that recorded somewhere? Does everybody know I own it? One of the say fun things around blockchain was its anonymity or pseudonymity, and whether or not the token holder is the token holder and who you are. You can't have that in a regulated financial environment. We talk about secondary market liquidity as a critical issue. Never get into something you can't get out of. And in any investment, the higher the risk, broadly speaking, the less liquid it is. And real estate has always suffered from that, been a highly illiquid investment and so categorized as high risk, although I have my own views on that, which probably come across in the book, but I'm happy to talk about outside of this forum. And then I mentioned tax and investor classification. Again, don't get into something you don't know how to get out of, or certainly that you don't know how to get out of without the government burning you for a lot of tax. So the UK and the upcoming budget has put the frighteners on a lot of investors and investment more generally, and remains a bit of a problem as to uncertainty in the future. But investor classification, obviously there's a lot of say regulations around who you are and what you can do. Do you know what you're doing is a big question, although certainly in the UK we have quite a preferential sophisticated investor regime which allows people to take risks. I think the people on this call probably understand those, certainly technologically better than most. But I will leave that there, and I will invite any questions. And I was trying to be a little bit quicker. And
so Jeremy is asking, my view is that until there are regulated exchanges for secondary scale tokenization, don't succeed. Do you know of any?
Do I know of any? Well, most exchanges are regulated in some way or are having regulation brought to bear with them. Specifically, no. For these types of securities, there are platforms, and there's two or three names that spring to mind that I think I touch on them in the book as well, that, or well, within which you can create a private exchange, but it's very project specific. And yeah, well, you've just mentioned, yeah, I was about to say is that you suffer from market liquidity issues, and then, market makers. What is the capital that signs on that? Because it's not as an exchange is not simply I want to sell and you want to buy. There needs to be intermediation around that. And this is where banks or the regulated entities actually provide liquidity in a market to facilitate those sorts of transactions. And I'm not sure they exist. I agree. So question mark how you do it. But it is a matter of scale. The more people you have, the greater the likelihood you can create that liquidity. Or you have to create your own liquidity pool, and that leads other issues around liquidity protocols, and whether or not they work is a different question. We need some market makers. Yeah, quite right. But maybe the bank, maybe the MUFG, for example, moving in is then now going to create the default, or will be the default market maker for that particular investment, which would stand to reason.